So when I first started buying diesel equipment, I think my first diesel machine was my Komatsu excavator. I needed a way to keep it fueled. So I started out, I bought like 5 of these cans, and I could just go to the fuel station, the gas station, fill them up, and then use them to keep the equipment fueled. And that worked fine for a while until I started buying bigger machines, and I was running the machines more. Then going to the gas station with a bunch of 5-gallon cans just wasn't practical anymore, because it was too many cans and you were there too often and it just took up too much time. So then after I started using 5-gallon cans, I started using these 55-gallon barrels. These are nice because you can get them cheap. I really started using these after I bought my bigger Hitachi excavator, and I was running the thing, you know, like all day, every day for a couple weeks. The 5-gallon cans just, it was like a dry, you couldn't do it. You were constantly going to the gas station. So this was nice, but I don't really feel these are great for fuel storage because the metal of these is just kind of thin. Now these are nice because, you know, you can pick them up, you can roll these around. They're a little heavy to stand up though. I made this ring that you go around here and then you clamp it with a wing nut, and then it had a chain, and you can pick these up full with that. And generally the fuel delivery guys won't fill these, so, you know, these are okay sort of, but really a much better option is, alright, so for pumping the fuel out of barrels or any other type of container, I was using this rotary pump. These are nice because these are cheap. They don't need any electric or anything. You just stick it in and crank it and it's pumping fuel. But, you know, they're okay. You know, once you're doing like a huge amount of fuel, these get kind of frustrating because you're there pumping forever. Plus, you really got to watch on this end to make sure you're not overfilling whatever you're filling up. So, you know, these are okay, but not ideal. Alright, so after I realized those rotary pumps weren't really cutting it, the hand pump, I started buying these electric 12-volt ones. And I've just been buying the cheapest ones. You know, they usually work fine. And then, you know, this, you could just hook this up to the battery on whatever you're fueling. And then you have an actual nozzle like you'd have at a gas station. One note on these nozzles, the cheap ones that come with them, this is not an auto stop nozzle. So you got to keep an eye on this to make sure you're not going to overfill the container you're filling up. They sell the auto stop ones. They're a little bit pricey, but it's kind of worth it, because then you can just, you know, like at a gas station, put it on, walk away from it, and there's no danger of your tank being overfilled. Alright, I'm sure this is bugging a bunch of people, and it's bugging me too. So let me do something about that. Alright, so every time this fuel changes tanks, I always put a filter on. And I like these filters. They're clear because you can see what's going on inside of them. Alright, so I just picked up this swivel thing. So that hose won't be kinked anymore. The Teflon tape. Usually that white Teflon tape that they sell, the cheapest stuff, that's only meant for either air or water. You want to make sure you get one that's rated for fuel, because the fuel can rot that white tape. So with diesel fuel, the fumes on diesel aren't explosive. You know, with gasoline, you wouldn't want to do this. I'm sure a bunch of you are going to tell me I should have a barb fitting here instead of that piece of pipe, but you know what? That doesn't leak at all, so. Alright, look how much better that is. That's nice, now that I don't have that kinked hose all the time. Alright, my favorite tanks to use are these 275 oil tanks. These are pretty cheap, but you can usually even get these for free. You know, I've scrapped dozens of these tanks because they're just so common, but one modification I usually do to them. This is how they usually sell these tanks and expect you to use them. Just with a piece of pipe that's pretty long as a leg. Now that's alright if the tank is just sitting there, but if you're occasionally moving it around, these are really frustrating because these mounts will bend and it's just annoying. So all I'll do, what works well is I'll cut this leg a lot shorter and then bend a piece of pipe as like a skid and then put some other like rebar and stuff to reinforce it. That way if you needed to, you could move this tank around even while it's full. And it's easy. You can slide the thing right around and the legs, you know, don't bend or break off. Another thing I've done sometimes is I'll put a lifting eye on it. So that's just a piece of rebar welded on there. This is a nice old tank and the metal's really thick on it, so you know, this has been sufficient to pick it up. I don't know if I would do that on a new one that they sell. This one here is new and the metal's a lot thinner on that tank, so you know, keep note of that. If you're, really you shouldn't be moving these tanks around full. They're not meant for it. You don't want to have any fuel spills. So the tips I have on that, you know, one thing people say is like, oh, these tanks, you know, replace them after a certain age. I don't think that's really the case here, or the case with these tanks, because these old ones, the metal's a lot thicker, and I think you're better off with the old ones. You can tell the age of them. The old ones usually have these rounded edges, and the new ones, the ends look like that. But a good example, why not? My friend recently, he had one of these tanks in his basement for his heat, and the tank had a date on it, and it was only an 8-year-old tank, and it was inside, and he had just had it filled, and you can tell when these tanks, they won't just burst and leak all at once. Usually what they'll do is they'll get like a rust spot on them, and then you'll tell that spot will be a little bit wet. And what you don't want to do, what he did, he saw that, and then he went digging at it, and then that made a hole. The thing was leaking. So, in order to, the ways that, and he was trying to patch it with like chewing gum or stupid stuff, that's not going to work. They do sell like magnetic patches that you can put on these tanks in an emergency. That's usually the way to fix them. But his wife like called the heating company, and you don't want to call them because they'll charge you $1 billion and turn it into a huge nightmare. I went over there with one of these tanks, pumped his tank empty, and then we changed his tank and cleaned up. You know, it was only leaking for an hour or so. We cleaned it up in his basement, no problem. But so you can't really go by the age of these tanks, because that was an 8-year-old tank that failed because of rust. So the tips I have to make sure these tanks aren't leaking, I really think these tanks should be stored inside and on concrete, because if they get a leak, you'll see the wet spot. You won't mistake it for rain or something, and then on the concrete you'd maybe see a wet spot in the ground, and then you'll be able to detect it immediately, and you can deal with the issue right away. And you know, these tanks, they're not worth patching or anything. And as far as disposal, I've been meaning to do a video on that next time I have to dig one of these tanks out of the ground or something, but I haven't had one in a while. And I know there's people even like certified to do these, but generally if you go to remove an underground tank for a customer, one, they're always going to tell you it's empty. It's never going to be empty, ever. So what you do is you take like one of these pumps and pump from start from the top, because if you go to the very bottom, it's going to be nothing but sludge, and you'll clog up your filters continuously. So start from the top, pump down until you start ruining filters. Then that's about then you got all the fuel out of it, and the rest of the stuff, usually at the bottom, there's always like a layer of just sludge and garbage that's not any good. So, you know, get the tank out without spilling anything. I was just talking to this company on this. I sold him a piece of equipment, and we were talking for a while about disposing these tanks. And he was like a certified company. He said what they do is they cut a hole in the tank to clean it, and physically go inside the tank with paper towels and stuff and wipe out the whole tank. That's a crappy job. What I generally do when I have these tanks that are garbage, just build a big fire, put the tank right on top of the fire, Have the holes facing up, have the holes, all the vents, don't have it closed up, have all the vents out of it, and then that fire will burn the tank completely clean, and you can crush the tank up with an excavator and bring it for recycling, and it's perfectly clean metal by that point. Alright, for fuel storage, I've heard a few different rules about this. I've heard, and this could vary depending on your area, I've heard you're supposed to have a permit if you're storing more than 1,000 gallons on a site. To me, that rule makes sense. And, that's a lot of fuel, too. Like, I never have, I have 4 tanks in here, but I'm never filling all these tanks. There's always, 2 of them empty. So, that's never really been an issue for me. The other thing, generally the thing is that the whole reason rules get made in the first place is when people do stupid things and have, oil spills. So, that's the whole thing. Don't leak oil on the ground. If you got a tank that's leaking, deal with it immediately, clean it up properly. I have heard tanks up to 1,000 gallons need to have a secondary containment. So a lot of times when you see those big 1,000-gallon tanks, they'll have a big bathtub underneath them. And that way, if the tank ever fails, all the fuel will get caught in the secondary tank. So as far as fueling these tanks, generally it's a lot easier just to have your fuel delivered. Because there's, for off-road equipment, home heating oil is the same thing as diesel. It's just got a red dye in it. So just get home heating oil delivered. The whole thing with the red dye, that's like a road tax thing. So you don't want to use the red dye fuel in your trucks, because the whole point of the road taxes, that's why the fuel you buy at a pump is more money, because it's clear, because you're paying a tax on it. And that's one rule I never break. I'll never put the red fuel in a truck, because if you get stopped at a DOT stop and they check that, that's a pretty big fine. Generally when I'm in my dump truck, I just go to the gas station and fill up when I'm near the gas station, because that's a truck you're driving down the road anyway, so it's really not a big deal to deal with that. I'll usually just use this fuel in the equipment. One time I was looking at a truck for sale, and the guy that guy was pretty crazy, but what he did to that truck? He cut the gas tank in half. And not in half, but he left he made the gas tank 2 separate chambers, and the very corner chamber under where you fill it up was a fake tank that he had filled up with clear fuel, and then the rest of the tank, the majority of it, he was filling up with the red fuel with the no road tax, and it had a hidden fuel fill up thing, and he was doing that so he could put the legally put the red fuel in it and save a little bit of money. I thought that was pretty funny, because that's the type of thing you would talk about doing but not actually do, because that's a pretty big commitment, cutting your tank in pieces and then welding it back together. But that truck was a piece of garbage. I didn't buy it anyway. But another problem I had this year, the fuel that they bring you in the summertime is different than the fuel that they bring in wintertime. The winter fuel is treated to handle lower temperatures. Now, obviously, if you live in Florida or something, this isn't an issue for you. But if you live somewhere where it gets cold and you're using fuel that you bought in July, that fuel is going to gel up in the wintertime. So all you really got to do is treat it. There's a few different things you can put in the fuel to treat it that they sell over the counter. Or you can even cut it with kerosene. That does a really good job, too. Alright, so for equipment on these tanks, you got your pump with your filter. Always have a filter. I usually like to put in a gauge. So this says, it's a full tank, but it's just handy to know how much fuel's in the tank. I'll usually block off one hole. Then install one of these vents. And when you're filling these tanks up, don't fill them to the very, very top. Leave 3 or 4 inches. The reason is because with temperature changes, the fuel will actually expand and contract. And if you have it full to the top and it gets warmer out, the fuel can expand and it will spill out the vent. And when you're filling these up too, it's nice so you don't have to look in them. They sell a whistle, so it whistles when it's full or whistles when it's on, something like that. There is a whistle available to help when you're filling these up. Okay, so the best way I found to move fuel around and bring it to your machines on job sites is you get a transfer tank like this that goes in the back of a pickup truck. Usually it's kind of shaped like an L, so it fits right under the toolbox. These tanks hold 100 gallons of fuel. get a bunch of people commenting that I need a new toolbox. And, you know, you're right, I do. But, you know, this one kind of matches my truck, so I don't really mind it, you know. So I'm going to talk about some of the different gas can nozzles that are available. These ones here, this is Briggs & Stratton, and you can see, you know, these are available in the stores right now, and these are so bad, I think the person who designed these should be in prison, because these are garbage. They leak absolutely everywhere, and you cannot get fuel out of these cans. So these are trash. Completely stay away from these. These you see sometimes, but not very often. They're okay, but I still don't really like it. These ones are pretty good. They don't really leak. The fuel flows out of them pretty quickly. You got to do a few modifications to them. It's got this pour store button thing here, which is kind of, because you can't push it down unless you put it on pour, and still in it. So that's kind of frustrating. So what you do is you rip that right out of there, and then it's like this. And now this can, you can just start and stop it. You know, you can be essentially holding this can like this and just push, and this is like an on-off switch for it. So these cans are pretty nice. The fuel cans that they sell, for whatever, I've heard a few different rumors on this, but whatever the reason is, the new ones don't have vents on the back of the can because they're supposed to be spill-proof or something, but they don't work at all. Watch what happens when I try to pour any fuel out of this can. So that's what they consider. Can you see that trickle? I don't see how they think that's acceptable, but that just doesn't work. You'll be standing there for 15 minutes trying to pour the contents of fuel out of this can. So what you got to do is you got to put a vent in this can. So here's an example of one I already did. And they sell these on eBay, and I was buying them in like quantities of 100, I think, for $25 or something. But I don't have a drill bit on me right now, but you drill a 1/2-inch hole and you put a vent in the gas in the can. So now look at the difference now. See, now the thing actually works. So, alright, so to fix these gas cans that don't have vents, take a 1/2-inch drill bit, snap it shut, alright, get it started and pop it in with a hammer. Now you have a gas can that actually works. For gas cans that actually work, where you don't have to modify them or anything, these are kind of the best ones. Alright, so these cans are pretty good. The gas flows out of them at a nice rate. You can start and stop them, you know, like on, off, real easy with your thumb. And they won't let you overfill, see? So if you want to buy a gas can that you don't have to modify or anything, these are probably the best ones. And they sell these cans yellow for diesel or blue for kerosene. Another nice product is this funnel here. It's got a filter built right into it that claims it will separate any particles and separate water from the fuel. So if you're trying to, you know, recover fuel out of something, or... You know what else is nice about these cans? They have a nice big opening to fill them up. So a lot of the products I showed in this video, I'll put links in the video description for where you can find them. I was looking, while I was working on that, I found this, because usually the meter, I don't have any fuel meters because they're usually expensive. Look, here's one for over $100, and usually the auto stop nozzles are expensive too, like, you know, $150 plus or $200. But here's one for $44 with a meter built into it. So, I mean, that seems great. So I ordered one of them to see how it is, but if it's good, I'm going to replace every nozzle I have with one of these. So, yeah, the links will be in the description for all the stuff in this video. And same thing, that last video I just put out, that snowplow video, you know, I had the whole description full of links on that too, because I used a lot of great products in that. And I forgot to even mention it in the video, and I don't think anyone ever looks at the description. So, yeah, if you were interested in any of the things I had in that video and you're wondering where to find them, just check the description.